April 20th, 1944, 05:30 a.m. Outside the village of Târgu Frumos, Romania. Leutnant Hans-Ulrich Meyer wiped the condensation from the lens of his periscope. Inside the cramped, steel-smelling interior of his Panther Ausf FG, the air was thick with the scent of diesel, grease, and the nervous sweat of 5 men. Meyer was 23 years old, but in the spring of 1944, he was already a veteran of 1,000 steel-on-steel duels. He believed in his machine. The Panther was the pride of the Panzerwaffe. It had 80 millimeters of sloped frontal armor, effectively over 120 millimeters of protection against direct fire. It carried the 7.5 centimeter KWK-42 L-70, a weapon so precise and powerful that it could core a Soviet T-34 at 2 kilometers before the Russian crew even heard the muzzle blast. To Meyer, the Eastern Front was a game of mathematics, and for 2 years the math had favored the Germans. The Soviet T-34 was fast, but its armor was thin. The KV-1 was tough, but its gun was weak. As long as the Panther kept its front to the enemy, it was an invincible wall. 1,800 meters, edge of the tree line, the gunner whispered. Meyer adjusted his sight. Through the morning mist, he saw a shape. It was low, wide, and painted in the dull, dark green of the Red Army. But it wasn't a T-34. It was larger. The turret was rounded like a cast-iron bowl, and it sat further forward on the hull. And then he saw the gun. It was a monster, a long, thick barrel tipped with a massive double-baffle muzzle brick. It looked less like a tank gun and more like a piece of heavy field artillery that had been grafted onto a chassis. "Identify," Meyer ordered. I don't know, Lieutenant," Fritz stammered. "Maybe a KV-85 or a captured Tiger?" "It doesn't matter. Range 1,700, APCR, fire when ready." The Panther rocked back as the 7.5 centimeter gun barked. A streak of white light tore across the field. Meyer watched the tracer. It was a perfect shot. It struck the front plate of the mysterious Russian tank dead center. In any other battle, in any other year, that would have been the end. The shell should have punched through, turned the interior into a furnace, and sent the turret flying. But it didn't. Meyer watched in horror as the shells struck the sloped armor, erupted in a shower of sparks, and ricocheted into the sky like a spent firework. The Russian tank didn't stop. It didn't even flinch. It began to turn its massive turret towards them. Meyer felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. The math had just changed. The invincible wall had met a sledgehammer. And Hans-Ulrich Meyer was about to realize that the war he thought he was winning had already been lost in a factory in the Ural Mountains. To understand the shock that Meyer felt, you have to understand the panic that was happening in the Soviet High Command in 1943. The Battle of Kursk was a victory for the Red Army, but it was a Pyrrhic one. The Soviet crews watched their T-34s bounce shells off the new Tigers and Panthers while being picked off from miles away. Stalin himself had issued a decree: "We need a tank that can look a tiger in the eye and make it blink." The Soviet engineers didn't have time for the precision engineering of the Germans. They didn't care about ergonomic seats or high-quality optics. They wanted 3 things: armor that could stop a Panther, a gun that could shatter a Tiger, and a weight that wouldn't sink into the Russian mud. They took the chassis of the heavy KV tank and redesigned it. They used cast armor, pouring molten steel into molds to create rounded shapes that were naturally better at deflecting shells. They sloped the front plate at 60 degrees. But the real stroke of madness was the gun. They didn't use a tank gun. They took the 122 millimeter D-25T field howitzer, a weapon designed to level buildings, and shoved it into the turret. It was a compromise. The shells were so large they had to be loaded in 2 pieces, the projectile first, then the propellant charge. This meant the IS-2 could only fire 2, maybe 3 rounds a minute. A Panther could fire 10. But the Soviet philosophy was simple. You only need to hit a Panther once. Let's talk about the math that Leutnant Meyer didn't know yet. The Soviet 122 millimeter D-25T gun was a monster.
It fired a 55-pound shell at a muzzle velocity of 780 meters per second. But the key wasn't the velocity, it was the mass. When a German 7.5-centimeter shell hits a tank, it's like a needle trying to find a weak spot. It needs to penetrate the armor to do damage. When a Soviet 122-millimeter shell hits a tank, it's like a sledgehammer hitting a brick wall. Even if the shell doesn't pierce the armor, the sheer kinetic energy, over 8 million joules, is enough to cause spalling. Spalling is a phenomenon where the shock wave of the impact travels through the steel plate. When it hits the inner surface of the armor, it causes shards of the tank's own steel to flake off at supersonic speeds. Inside the tank, these shards act like a shotgun blast. They shred the crew, ignite the ammunition, and sever the fuel lines. The Panther Leutnant Meyer was sitting in had been designed to stop a needle. It was never designed to survive a sledgehammer. Back in the field, the IS-2 had finished its turn. The massive 122-millimeter barrel was now directly pointed at Meyer's Panther. "Driver, reverse, now!" Meyer screamed.
The Panther's Maybach engine roared, its tracks clawing at the Romanian soil. They slid backward, trying to get behind a low ridge. But the IS-2 was faster than it looked. It didn't need to stop to aim. The Soviet crew had been trained to fire for effect. The muzzle of the IS-2 erupted in a flash of orange flame so large it obscured the entire tank. A cloud of black smoke rolled across the field. Meyer didn't hear the sound of the shell. He felt it. The 122-millimeter projectile struck the Panther's mantlet, the thickest part of its armor. The impact felt like being inside a bell that had been struck by a wrecking ball. Meyer was thrown against the side of the turret. His ears rang with a high-pitched whine. Smoke began to pour from the instrument panel. "Status!" he choked out. "Optics are gone!" Fritz screamed. "The gun is jammed!" The Panther's turret had been knocked off its race. The 80 millimeters of steel hadn't been pierced, but the force of the 122-millimeter hit had sheared the bolts holding the turret in place. The pride of German engineering was now a multi-million-mark paperweight. And the IS-2 was still coming. Meyer looked out of his hatch. To his left and right, the other Panthers of his platoon were experiencing the same nightmare. One Panther had been hit in the side. Its entire turret had been blown clean off the hull, landing 10 meters away in the mud. Another was burning, its crew scrambling out of the hatches only to be cut down by the IS-2's heavy machine gun. This wasn't a tank battle. It was an execution. While Meyer was trying to save his crew, the German high command was in a state of total denial. When the first reports of the IS-2 reached Berlin, Heinz Guderian, the father of the Blitzkrieg, dismissed them. The Russians cannot build a 122-millimeter tank. The recoil would flip the tank over. The crew wouldn't have room to breathe. It is a propaganda myth. But the myth was destroying his best divisions. By May 1944, the German army conducted a secret test on a captured IS-2. They fired their best guns at it, the 88 from the Tiger and the 7.5-centimeter from the Panther. The results were terrifying. At 1,000 meters, the Panther's gun could only penetrate the IS-2's front if it hit a tiny flat spot on the driver's hatch. The Tiger's 88 fared better, but even it struggled against the rounded turret. Meanwhile, the 122-millimeter Soviet shell was found to be capable of knocking out a Tiger at 1,500 meters. The German response was typical: build something bigger. They doubled down on the King Tiger, a 70-ton monster that was so heavy it broke every bridge it tried to cross. They spent thousands of man-hours on the Mouse, a tank so large it couldn't even move under its own power. They were trying to win a war of industrial scale with a philosophy of artisanal engineering. The Soviets, meanwhile, were producing 200 IS-2s a month. They didn't care if the tank was uncomfortable. They didn't care if the optics were blurry. They knew that if you put enough 122-millimeter sledgehammers on the field, the invincible German walls would eventually crack. To understand why Meyer was losing, you have to look beyond the battlefield. You have to look at the factories.
In the German factories, a Panther was built like a Swiss watch. Every part was machined to a thousandth of an inch. The optics were the best in the world. The engines were high-performance masterpieces. But a Swiss watch is fragile, and it's hard to build 10,000 of them in a year while your factories are being bombed. In the Soviet factories, Tankograd as they called it, an IS-2 was built like a tractor. The welds were rough. The armor was cast, not machined. The interior was painted with whatever was available. But a tractor is reliable, and you can build 10,000 of them in a year while your country is being invaded. The Soviets had realized something that the Germans never did. In a war of attrition, good enough in huge numbers is always better than perfect in small numbers. The IS-2 was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. It was a tank designed for a single purpose, to break the German spirit. By mid-1944, the German Panzer crews was starting to break. It wasn't just the fear of dying, it was the loss of their superiority complex. For 3 years, the German soldier had been told that he was the master of the world because his technology was better. He believed that a single German tank was worth 10 Russians once. But at Targu Frumos, Meyer saw the truth. He saw that the Untermenschen in the east had built a machine that made his Panther look like a toy. The 122mm shock wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The German crews began to hesitate. They stopped taking aggressive risks. They started to see Stalin tanks behind every bush and every ridge. This hesitation was more deadly than any shell. In a tank battle, the first one to fire usually wins, and the German crews were now so afraid of the IS-2 that they were waiting for the perfect shot, a shot that usually never came. April 20th, 1944, 06:15 a.m. "Reverse! Get us into the gully," Meyer ordered. The Panther's driver slammed the gear into reverse. The engine roared, the tracks clawing at the Romanian soil. They slid backward, the broken turret swaying uselessly. Meyer watched as 3 IS-2s crested the ridge. They moved with a slow, predatory confidence. They knew they were the kings of the battlefield. Behind the tanks, thousands of Soviet infantrymen were screaming "Ora!" as they surged forward. For the first time in the war, Meyer felt a sense of existential dread. It wasn't just the fear of dying, it was the realization that the system he served had failed him. He had been told that German science was superior. He had been told that the Untermenschen in the East were incapable of complex thought. Yet here was a machine that had outthought, outgunned, and out-armored the best that Germany had to offer. The IS-2 wasn't just a tank, it was a message from the future. A message that said the era of the ace was over, and the era of the assembly line had begun. Meyer's Panther reached the safety of the gully. He ordered the crew to bail out. They didn't have time to destroy the tank. The Russians were already entering the village. As he ran towards the German lines, Meyer looked back one last time. He saw an IS-2 drive straight through the wall of a farmhouse, crushing it like it was made of cardboard. The tank didn't slow down. It didn't stop to aim. It just kept moving west, towards Berlin. The encounter at Targu Frumos was just the beginning. Over the next 12 months, the IS-2 would lead the charge through Poland, into East Prussia, and finally into the heart of the Third Reich. The German Panzerwaffe tried to adapt. They developed the Panzerfaust, a cheap, disposable anti-tank rocket that allowed a single soldier to kill an IS-2. It was a desperate, effective weapon, but it was an admission of defeat. They had lost the tank war, so they turned their children into tank killers. But the IS-2 kept coming. By April 1945, the IS-2s were sitting in front of the Reichstag. Their 122mm guns were turning the seat of Nazi power into a pile of rubble. The Stalin sledgehammer had done its job. It had broken the wall. Today, the IS-2 is often overshadowed by the Tiger or the T-34, but for the men who stood in its path in 1944, it was the most terrifying machine on Earth. The 122mm shock was the moment the German soldier realized that no matter how good his training was, no matter how precise his gun was, he couldn't stop the industrial avalanche that was coming for him. The math had finally caught up with the Reich, and the answer was written in the smoke of a 122-millimeter muzzle blast. The story of the IS-2 isn't a story of a perfect tank. The IS-2 was flawed. It was slow, cramped, and its gun was difficult to use. But it was the right tank for the moment. It was a weapon designed to break the will of an enemy that believed it was invincible. And in the end, that is how wars are won. Not with Swiss watches, but with sledgehammers. If you found this look into the enemy's perspective of the IS-2 fascinating, hit that like button. It helps us share these forgotten moments of historical realization. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're uncovering the stories of the men who stood in the path of the most devastating weapons of World War II. Drop a comment below. If you were a Panther commander and saw an IS-2 appearing on the horizon, what would be your first thought? Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering the history that changed the world. See you in the next one.